Okay, sorry about the delay. I'm still trying to figure out all of the steps involved in running these Zoom meetings and recording all of the lectures. So anyway, hopefully everybody is done with the quiz by now. What I want to do to start the class today is show you guys a really quick video. It's about 3 minutes long of a famous macroeconomist who actually, he passed away several years ago, Milton Friedman. You may have heard of him before. But in this short clip, he is discussing some of the benefits of what he refers to as the free exchange system. So hopefully this will help motivate the topic that we're going to talk in much greater detail about today and also into the next class. Okay, so let's watch this together, and then we will begin the lecture.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black line, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was the magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
I could do without the music, but you get the point there. Okay, that's from, by the way, from an old PBS documentary series on a bunch of different economic topics that Milton Friedman actually produced a few decades ago. Later on in the semester, I'll have you watch another one of his episodes from that series on the effects of inflation. I think I'm getting the hang of this. All right. Okay, so in the lecture today and into the class on Thursday, we're going to be looking at in much greater detail this idea about the possible benefits from the free exchange system. This free trade system gives rise to the kind of economic interdependence and the coordination that Milton Friedman was talking about in that short little video clip. Now, he articulates the benefits of the free exchange system by using an example of an ordinary pencil, a very simple consumer item, okay? But I think it's really straightforward to place his argument in a broader context that hopefully you guys will start to think about today. If you really think about this, there's only two ways that people can satisfy their consumption wants, legally, I should say. right? One is that you can be what's called economically self-sufficient, meaning that whatever you decide to consume, whatever basket of different goods and services you want to consume, you're going to produce those goods all by yourself, right? That's what we mean by economic self-sufficiency. That's pretty rare, right? The other way, much more common way to meet your consumption needs is to actually specialize in the production of one good or service, or maybe even a few different goods and services, and then engage in trade with other people who are specializing in the production of different goods and services that you might also demand, okay? With very rare exceptions, people, families, communities, cities, states, countries tend to rely on the second option, that is specialization and trade with one another to meet their consumption demands. Milton Friedman, in this short little video clip, I think explains it very well in the example of a simple pencil, right? What he tried to say was that there's not a single person on planet Earth that actually knows how to make this pencil all by him or herself, right? All of the knowledge, all of the skills and resources that go into actually making this pencil and providing it to the consumer at a ridiculously low cost cannot actually be obtained by any single one person, right? It requires the coordination of many, many, many different people, probably thousands of different people. But how does that coordination occur? It's not through some central planner or a commissar, as Milton Friedman likes to describe it. A central planner that decides, what is going to be produced and who is going to get those items and at what price, but rather through this kind of decentralized free exchange system where prices move around and determine essentially who gets what. That's how goods and resources are rationed or allocated in a free trade system, okay? That's the basic economic point that Milton Friedman is trying to make. All right, so in today's lecture, we're going to examine much more closely this economic idea that trade can make everyone better off. By the way, this was one of the 10 big ideas that was in those introductory set of slides that we talked about on the first day of the semester. We just didn't cover it in class, right? We got through the first 3 or 4 big ideas, but if you kept going, you would find that the next one was this idea that trade can make everyone better off. What is it exactly that people or countries, in our case, actually gain when they trade with one another? Can we somehow quantify what those gains are using a simple economic model? That's one of the goals for today. The answer to that question, I think, is going to help us understand why it is people actually choose to be economically interdependent, right? Hardly anyone, I don't know anyone actually, that chooses to be totally economically self-sufficient, right? We all, in effect, choose to rely on one another to meet our basic consumption needs, okay? Why do we make that choice? Well, it's because there are gains from trading with one another. And the exercise that I want to go through today is going to show us how we can quantify exactly what those gains are and help us provide answers to why it is people choose to be interdependent as opposed to self-sufficient. Okay, so here's how we're going to go about doing this. To understand what it is that people actually gain when they trade with one another, we're going to construct and use a very simple macroeconomic model of international trade, okay? This model is going to feature a few key assumptions which simplify the complex world. That way we can really get at the heart of the economic issue, and that is the gains from trade. So what are the assumptions in the model that we're going to use today? First off, we're going to assume that there's only 2 countries in the world, Let's just call them the US of A and Japan, all right? Now, those two countries, or people that are living in those two countries, would like to consume and are capable of producing only two different goods. Those goods are computers and wheat. How those two goods are actually produced in each country, the US and Japan, comes from only one scarce resource, and that's going to be labor, measured in units of hours, okay? Now, are these assumptions realistic? No, they're completely ridiculous if you think about it, right? We live in a world where there's a lot more than two countries. We consume thousands of different goods and services, okay? And surely there are lots of different resources used to produce stuff with. But that's not the point. The whole point of an economic model is to simplify all that complexity around us so that we can really understand the essence of the economic problem at hand. And that is, where do these gains from trade come from? If we can identify that in this super easy little model of two countries and two goods with one input, then it's really not hard, if you think about it, to extend the idea to multiple countries, to numerous different goods, and several different resources. So our goal here today is to try to understand what the gains from trade are in this simple model, and to illustrate kind of where they come from. Okay, in doing that, we're going to use the model in a couple of different ways, or we're going to use the model to look at a couple of different cases, I should say. The first case is what happens if both of these two countries here choose to be self-sufficient. That is, they only consume what each country can by itself produce. We want to compare those outcomes to what would happen if we allowed trade to take place between the US and Japan. Now think about this from a scientific perspective for a minute. What we want to do here is figure out what the gains from trade are. The only way to do that with an economic model like this is to actually compare two cases. What would the world look like without trade? And then what would the world look like with trade? Are there any gains to be had between those two different cases? That's how we use an economic model. So in going through the exercise that we're going to do today, we want to compare these two cases, the no trade case to the trade case. That will enable us to really illuminate quantitatively what the specific gains from trade are. That's how economic models are used. This just being a very simple one. Okay, you guys have any questions then so far about where we're going with this? You may have seen exercises like this before in your micro principles class. So hopefully some of this will just kind of jog your memory. So let me start off by talking about the production technology for the United States, the first of our potential trading partners here. What this slide is going to show you is what our assumptions look like for how the US transforms its scarce resource, labor, into actual final goods. In this case, computers or wheat, okay? So here's one of our first assumptions. We're going to assume that the US has 50,000 hours of labor available for production every single month, okay? So that's taken as a given. Here's how the technology is described for the US. Producing one computer, we'll assume, requires 100 hours of labor. Alternatively, producing 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor, okay? Now you may already be thinking, well, wait a minute, Givens, if we change the numbers around here, are we going to get wildly different results? Are our results dependent on these numbers? Well, yes and no. The specific quantitative results will depend on the numbers we choose, but I assure you that the descriptive results we get, the fact that there are gains to be had from trade, don't actually depend on what these specific numbers are. You can change them around and you're still going to get the same basic result. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is describe the US's production technology on this thing that you just took a quiz on a few minutes ago, and that is the production possibilities frontier. By the way, hopefully you guys recognize that the numbers in the example of U.S. and Japan is the same as the examples from the slides on the second chapter, Thinking Like an Economist. So some of this, or all of this, really should carry over from those sets of slides. Okay, so we want to construct the production possibilities frontier for the U.S. in this example. How do we go about doing that? For a two-good model, what we want to do is we want to place a quantity of one of the two goods on the vertical axis here. I'm just going to choose wheat. I'm doing it on your own. You could choose computers. It won't matter. And on the horizontal axis, I'm going to put numbers of computers. Okay? So what we want to do is figure out what all the different possible combinations of computers and wheat that the United States can produce, given its scarce resource of hours, and given its production technology for transforming hours into computers and wheat. There's more than one way to do this, okay? I think the most straightforward way is to ask yourself first, what combination or how many of each good would be produced if the US in this example used all of its labor to produce one of the two goods? So let's start with computers first. How many computers could the US make in a month if it devoted all 50,000 hours of its labor to computer production, given the numbers that we assumed on the last slide? It takes 100 hours to make a computer, right? So go ahead. 500, right? 50,000 hours divided by 100 hours per computer gives us 500 computers at this blue dot right here, okay? So this is one potential production point, right? We could, in the US, make 500 computers and 0 tons of wheat if we totally specialize in computer production. Alternatively, if all of us in here start growing wheat, what would our production output be? It would be 5,000 tons of wheat and 0 computers, right? Because it takes 10 hours to make a ton of wheat. So 50,000 hours divided by 10 hours per ton gives us 5,000 tons of wheat. The production possibilities frontier for this simple example can be constructed by just tracing the line that connects these two kind of extreme points, all right? What this blue line represents, just to review this concept, it shows us the infinite number of different combinations of computers and wheat that the US can produce given its labor resources and given its production technology. That is how it transforms labor into computers and wheat. Now let me stop here for just a second and ask you a more interesting economic question. I want you to think about this for a second. Is there any implication, or am I making a statement or an assertion here about anything in particular by drawing the production possibilities frontier as a straight line? It has no curvature to it. Probably the ones that you've come across in other economics classes have kind of this concave shape to it, where the PPF kind of bends away from the origin. I've made an assumption here, actually, by drawing the PPF as a perfectly straight line. Any guesses about what that assumption or assertion is? What am I saying there? What am I implying? Yeah, go ahead, fourth row. Speak up just a little bit more. Yes, the opportunity cost is constant. Let's think about that for a second. Let's suppose that we've all decided to produce this point on our production possibilities frontier, 5,000 tons of wheat and 0 computers. If we want to produce 100 computers, what is the opportunity cost of that action? Well, we would have to give up 1,000 tons of wheat, right? What's your name? Alex. If we want to produce another 100 computers, then what do we have to give up? an additional 1,000 tons of wheat, moving from 4,000 to 3,000. You'll notice here that as drawing this as a straight line, the opportunity cost is constant as we move down the PPF. It never changes. So that's the correct observation, Alex. But what does that actually mean economically about resources in this case? Yes.
So the resource is labor, and so if labor doesn't improve and it's good, then the economy's not specializing.
Well, okay, I think that's sort of half right there. You're circling around the right answer. What it says here is that labor is, in this particular example, doesn't have any specialization with regard to wheat or computers.
Right.
Okay? In other words, labor is perfectly shiftable between wheat production and computer production. Okay? That's actually not the way the real world works. All right, let's think about this a little bit more, because I think this is an important point. Again, what if we're all collectively producing 5,000 tons of wheat and 0 computers? Now we've said, okay, we're eating way too much wheat. We want to have a computer, okay? We all come together and we decide we need to produce 100 computers. Who among us is going to produce the first 100 computers, or who should produce the first 100 computers? Whoever's the best at it, right? And therefore, whoever's relatively worse at producing wheat. And so what happens in that case? We're able to gain 100 computers without losing much wheat. But what if we want to produce another 100 computers? Who's the next guy or gal in here to produce those computers? Whoever's kind of the second best at that particular activity. And so we gain 100 computers, but we lose a little bit more wheat this time. What happens? The opportunity cost is increasing as we move from wheat to computers on the PPF, right? And you're going to have this kind of concave production possibilities frontier. So when you see that particular shape of a PPF, what you're saying economically is more than just that the opportunity cost is increasing. You're saying that resources are specialized, which makes sense, right? Some land is more suitable for growing peaches. Other land might be more suitable for growing potatoes and onions, right? Not every resource is perfectly shiftable, right? We're not just all robots. We have the ability to specialize, okay? And that's why most PPFs have this kind of concave shape. In this example, to keep everything as simple as possible, to keep the math as simple as possible, we're going to assume that it's just a linear PPF, that resources are perfectly shiftable in that case. Right, if you were making what is it? Bloody Marys and screwdrivers, isn't the alcohol vodka for both of those, right? Why am I asking you this? Let's say we have all the orange juice we need and all of the tomato juice we need. Those aren't scarce resources. The scarce resource is vodka, and we only have 6 shots of vodka, right? In that case, our production possibilities frontier between Bloody Marys and screwdrivers would be perfectly linear, right? 1 shot of vodka makes a screwdriver just as well as it makes a Bloody Mary, that kind of idea. Maybe I should just use that example next time I teach it. Okay. So what we want to do today is use this model, again, to consider 2 cases. What does the world look like? How much do we consume if we don't trade with Japan? And how much do we consume if we allow trade to take place? So let's look at the no trade case first. Let's just suppose, for the sake of simplicity here, that in the US, we decide to split our resources evenly between the production of these 2 goods. So we 25,000 hours are devoted to computer production, 25,000 hours to wheat production. How much of these 2 goods are we going to produce then? Well, that's really easy to find, right? It's just 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. It's this red point right smack dab in the middle of the US production possibilities frontier. Now, again, let me emphasize the point. In the absence of trade with Japan, If we've erected full trade barriers and we're not going to conduct any international trade, this is our production combination, but it's also necessarily our consumption decision. We can only consume what we actually can produce ourselves. Questions so far? Really straightforward? Okay. Let's move on to the case of Japan. And now I want to throw the ball into your court. I want you guys to, so I did the one for the US. Let me give you guys a few minutes to do the same exercise for Japan. Here is the production technology for Japan. Japan has 30,000 hours of labor available per month. So it doesn't have as many people as the US. Producing one computer requires 125 hours of labor. Producing 1 ton of wheat requires 25 hours of labor in Japan. What I want you to do on the next slide, or on a separate piece of paper, is construct the production possibilities frontier for Japan. And to make this comparable to what we did for the US, put wheat on the vertical axis and computers on the horizontal axis. So take like a minute there and then plot Japan's production possibilities frontier. My wife is trying to call me in the middle of class. It's a failure to communicate on my part. Okay, any takers here? What if Japan devotes all of its resources, labor, to producing computers? How many would it make? Just shout it out if anybody knows. You don't even have to raise your hand. 240, right? Why isn't that working? Here we go. We've got to get used to the clicker here. Making a computer requires 125 hours of labor, right? So 30,000 hours divided by 125 hours per computer produces 240 computers. In that case, Japan would produce 0 tons of wheat. What if Japan did the other extreme? Produced only wheat instead of computers, and how much wheat would it be able to produce? Hopefully you got 1,200 tons of wheat, right? So 30,000 hours divided by, what was it, 125 hours per ton of wheat. So Japan's production possibilities frontier, again, if we make the same assumption, that labor is perfectly shiftable for Japan, would be this straight line between these 2 points. That illustrates Japan's production possibilities. Anybody have any questions about how to do that? Straightforward? Okay. Let's also assume, just to make everything as simple as possible here, that Japan, in the absence of trade, is going to just split its resources evenly between computer and wheat production. All right, so it uses 15,000 hours to make computers and another 15,000 hours to make wheat. What combination of those 2 goods is it going to produce? Right here at this red point in the middle of its PPF, which would be what, 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. Again, in the absence of trade, if Japan had to be fully economically self-sufficient, this is the production point, and it's also the consumption point. Japan would not be able to consume beyond its own production means. All right, so to sum up what we've got so far, I think this is pretty straightforward. Without trade, so this is the first case that we're using our model to experiment with here. We have that in the US, consumers are gonna get 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. In Japan, consumers are gonna get 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. All right, what we wanna do is we wanna remember these 2 points, and we wanna use these and compare them to what could happen if we permit the United States and Japan to specialize in the production of one of the 2 goods and then trade with each other. Only then, when we make that numerical comparison, can we actually measure or quantify how much each country gains from trade with one another, okay? But to do this, we first need to see how much of each good is produced by each country. So in the no trade case, this is very easy. Whatever a country produces has to be what the country consumes. But if we allow for trade to take place, then a country's production decision need not coincide with its consumption decision. In fact, it shouldn't, right? Otherwise, there's no point to trade. So we're now going to consider this second case, and let's think about how much each country is going to produce, and then we can analyze a specific trade between the 2 countries and figure out how much each country is ultimately going to consume after the trade. Everybody follow? All right, so this second active learning exercise here tells us what the production plans are. All right, so let's pretend in this simple little model that we have trade delegates from Japan and the United States, and they've met at some conference, and they've agreed to conduct a trade with one another. One country is going to specialize in computers, one is going to specialize in wheat, and then there's going to be a trade. The first part of this process involves determining how much of each good each country is going to produce. So let's suppose that the US produces 3,400 tons of wheat. And let's suppose that Japan produces 240 computers. All right, what I want you all to do on the next couple of slides then is figure out how much of the other good each country can produce with the labor that it has left over. All right, now let me be clear about what I'm saying here. If the US agrees to produce 3,400 tons of wheat, how many computers would it produce with its remaining labor? If Japan makes 240 computers, how much wheat would it produce with its remaining labor? I want you guys to plot those production points on the PPF lines that you drew in the last few slides. And I don't mind walking through this one together with you. So let's start with the US. If the United States produces 3,400 tons of wheat, that's what they've agreed to produce, that's going to require 34,000 hours of labor, 100 hours per ton of wheat, right? And so how much labor does the US actually have left over then? 16,000, right? And so how many computers then could the US produce with 16,000 hours of labor? 160. Takes 100 hours to make a computer. And so this red point here illustrates the United States production promise. They're going to agree to make 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. What about Japan? Japan has agreed to make 240 computers. How many work hours does that take Japan to achieve? All 30,000, right? And so that leaves no labor in Japan for wheat production. And so what Japan has done here is effectively said, we're going to specialize completely, 100% in computer production at this red point and produce 0 tons of wheat. So those are the 2 production points that each of the 2 countries have promised to carry out. All right, so we've pinned down then the cooperative production plans. Before we actually illustrate an example of a trade between these 2 countries, let me review some terminology that hopefully you've seen before that describes trade between 2 countries. These are economic concepts that actually describe the flows of goods and services from one country to the next. And those are exports and imports. Hopefully you all have seen these concepts before, but if not, we'll review them really quickly. What are exports? These are goods that are produced domestically and sold abroad in foreign markets, right? So to export means to sell domestically produced goods abroad. In our example here, obviously the United States is going to be exporting some quantity of wheat to Japan. Japan is going to be exporting some number of computers to the US. What is an import? That's a good that's produced abroad in a foreign country, but sold in a domestic market, right? So to import means to purchase goods that are made in another country. So in this example, the US is going to be importing computers from Japan. Japan will be importing wheat from the United States. What are net exports? You guys know what that concept is? What's net exports? Go ahead. Right, it's the market value of a country's exports minus its imports. It's one of the 4 key components of a country's gross domestic product. So we'll talk about that later on in the semester. And that's what exports and imports mean. It measures the flows of these goods from one country to the next. Very good. Okay, so let's talk now in this third active learning exercise about the specific terms of trade between Japan and the US in this example. That is, at what price is the United States going to swap wheat for computers? At what rate will these 2 goods be traded across borders? That's what I mean by the terms of trade, or the price of the transaction here. All right, so here I picked out a specific example. Let us suppose that the US decides to export 700 tons of its wheat to Japan, and it's going to import 110 computers from Japan, which means Japan will import 700 tons of wheat from the US, but export 110 computers. That's the trade. 700 tons of wheat for 110 computers. Now here's the 2 basic questions I want you guys to answer. How much of each good will then be consumed in the US? And how much of each good will be consumed in Japan? And most importantly, I guess the third question is, are Japan and the United States both better off than what they would have been in the absence of a trade with one another? Well, we can analyze that graphically and numerically in this little example, okay? Let's start with the US production possibilities frontier. Now remember, how much did the US promise to produce? 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. They agree to import 110 computers from Japan and export 700 tons of wheat. So how we figure out how much is actually consumed in the US is simple. You just take the production, you add to it what the US imports, and you subtract what the US exports. And so what is consumption then? 160 plus 110 computers, we're able to consume 270 computers. 3,400 tons of wheat minus 700 that we export to Japan leaves us with 2,700 tons of wheat. Now here's the economically meaningful result. If we plot this consumption bundle between computers and wheat, and we plot it on our graph over here, what do you notice about that point? It's this blue point right here. Notice that it is beyond the production possibilities frontier for the United States. So free trade has kind of acted like magic here, sort of the way Milton Friedman described it in that video clip. It's enabled the United States to consume more than it otherwise would if it had been economically self-sufficient. Trade between the US and Japan has kind of magically created value for the US, right? When you were studying production possibilities frontiers, you might describe a point like this as being infeasible. You can't reach that point given the scarce resources we have. The only way to reach this point is what? If there's some technological growth factor that shifts the PPF outward, or if you're suddenly endowed with more resources. That's effectively what free trade does, is it acts similarly to something that would shift out the PPF, like an improvement in technology or a greater number of resources. And it's obtained through increased specialization. Okay, what about Japan? So we can do this quickly, right? Japan has agreed to produce 240 computers and 0 tons of wheat. It imports 700 tons of wheat from the US, but it exports 110 of its computers. And so what does Japan consume? 240 minus 110 leaves it with 130 computers. 0 plus 700 tons of wheat enables it to consume 700 tons of wheat, which is this blue point here. Once again, that combination is beyond Japan's own production possibilities frontier. So what we've done is we've illustrated with a very simple example how a mutually beneficial trade between Japan and the United States can create value for both countries. That's what trade enables one to do, is to kind of, through the free exchange system, to create additional value given the same amount of total resources between all the different trading partners. See how that works? Okay, now, if I ask you to specifically quantify what the gains from trade are, very straightforward. You just compare the consumption before trade to the consumption after trade. So for the United States, consumption was 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. With trade, we increased our computer consumption by 20 and our wheat consumption by 200. The blue numbers over here show what the actual gains from trade are in this example. For Japan, they went from consuming 120 computers to 130 computers, so that's plus 10 in the computer row. And they went from consuming 600 tons of wheat to 700 tons, so that's plus 100 tons of wheat for Japan. In this example, both countries have benefited from the trade. Now, what's one thing you notice here? You'll notice that both countries don't benefit equally from the trade, right? Who comes out on top in terms of who gains more in this example? The US. The US gains more computers compared to Japan and also gains more wheat compared to what Japan would gain. So I am not saying that the benefits of trade are spread evenly across all trading partners. Don't make that mistake. What I'm telling you is that both countries are going to be better off than what they would have been had they chosen not to trade at all, right? To figure out how they're going to split those gains from trade, all that is going to depend on how well each country can bargain, right? Is the bargaining power in the United States better than it is in Japan? We don't know, right? Now, we're never going to have a situation where the numbers in one country is negative, right? And why do we know that's not going to occur? No country would agree to the trade in the first place if they're going to lose consumption, right? So these numbers have to be positive, but how that total surplus, all of those gains from trade are split between the two trading partners, the model doesn't really give a clear answer to that, right? You need a richer model that explains how powerful one person's bargaining mechanism is to the other. And we won't cover that in the principles class. The The larger point here is that both trading partners can at least gain something by agreeing to a mutually beneficial trade. Questions? All of that pretty straightforward? Yeah? Okay. So what is it about this model then, this easy example, that allows both countries to actually benefit from this specific trade? Now, just to remind you, and if you don't believe me, I would encourage you to go back and try it. Go back and change some of the numbers that we used in our assumptions. The gains from trade are going to be different, but you're still going to find positive gains for both the US and Japan. All right, so the descriptive result doesn't hinge on what specific numbers we use. But where do these gains actually come from? We want to dig a little bit deeper with that question. And I think the best place to look, or the answer, if you will, lies in understanding which country can produce which good at a lower cost. All right? But as you know, there's more than one cost concept in economics that we need to be able to distinguish between, okay? The first cost concept that we're going to discuss today is cost measured in resources spent to produce a given amount of a good or a service. The comparison among trading partners according to how many resources one has to use to produce, in our case, computers or wheat, is what's referred to as absolute advantage. Hopefully you've seen this definition before. Absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. All right, so we would say that one country has an absolute advantage over another if it can produce the same amount of that good using fewer resources, labor in our example. Okay, so which country in our example today has the absolute advantage in wheat production? The US or Japan? Go ahead. The US does, right? It only takes the US 10 hours of labor to make a ton of wheat compared to 25 hours in Japan. So the US has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat. Now, this leads me to our first result. And it's the first of two results. And I'll say that it's the less important of the two, okay? If it turns out that each country in one of these two country models has an absolute advantage in one of the two goods, then gains from trade can always be had if each country specializes in the production of the good that it has an absolute advantage in and then trades with one another, right? Let's say it takes me an hour to mow the front yard, okay? It takes Neff 3 hours to mow the front yard. However, Neff is much better at doing laundry and folding clothes. It takes me all day to do that, right? I have the absolute advantage in cutting grass. Neff has the absolute advantage in folding the laundry. What my point here is that we would both benefit in this silly little example, Neff, if I mowed my grass and I mowed your grass, and that you did your laundry and my laundry, and that we traded with one another. Both tasks would get done more quickly in that case. If that situation happens, when each country has an absolute advantage in one of the two goods, then both can gain by specializing in the production of the good for which it has an absolute advantage. Now, I say all that because in our model today, in our example, which country had the absolute advantage in computer production? The US or Japan? Uh-oh. Who had the absolute advantage in computer production? The US did. The US can make a computer in 100 hours of labor compared to Japan's 125 hours of labor. So we just worked through an example where the United States had an absolute advantage then in the production of both goods. So why in the world then would the United States want to trade with Japan in the first place? If the US is actually better or more efficient at making each good, computers and wheat, then it almost seems like total production would fall if the US allowed Japan to produce anything. How does the US gain from trade with Japan if the US is better at making both of these two goods? What's the fallacy I'm committing here? Go ahead, Neff. Exactly, right? That we've compared costs between these two countries according to absolute advantage or resource usage. That's not actually the most relevant cost comparison. The most relevant cost for comparison to figuring out the actual gains from trade is in terms of opportunity cost, not in terms of resource costs, right? In our example, Neff, how do we measure the opportunity cost of a computer? How much wheat production you lose, not how much labor is used to produce computers. How do we measure the opportunity cost of wheat? In terms of how many computers you can't produce, not in terms of how much labor is required to make a computer, right? So comparative advantage is different than absolute advantage. This is the comparison among trading partners according to opportunity cost, not resource cost, right? We say that a country or a trading partner has a comparative advantage in one good over another if it can produce that good at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partner. To determine which country has the comparative advantage in our example then, what do we need to compute? We need to compute the opportunity costs of producing each good in each country. Only then can we identify who actually has the comparative advantage. So I know I'm close to running out of time today, but let me toggle over to the document camera here. And for those of you who are participating remotely, let me switch your view. Hopefully you guys can see this. Since I don't have a whiteboard in here, I'm going to be, anytime I need to come away from the slides, I'm just going to write it on a piece of paper under this camera here. So what I want to do is figure out in this simple little example, who has the comparative advantage in the production of each good. I mean, you actually already know the answer to this, right? The gains from trade were had by the US specializing in wheat production and Japan specializing in computers. But to prove that, we want to compute the opportunity costs of each good in each country. And so I've created this little table here. On the left-hand side, it shows the production technology for the US and Japan. It takes 100 hours to make one computer in the US compared to 125 hours in Japan. And then the numbers for wheat production. What I want to do over here on the right table is compute the opportunity cost in the US of producing one computer and the opportunity cost of producing 1 ton of wheat, both for the US and Japan. So who can help me out with this one? How would I compute the opportunity cost of making one computer in the United States? How do I get that information from the production technology over here on the left? Yes, fourth row. Right, so think about it. What is the opportunity cost? It's how much wheat is given up to produce one computer. So if we devote 100 hours that we use to make one computer to wheat production, how many tons of wheat can we produce in the United States? We can produce 10 tons. Alternatively, what's the opportunity cost of 1 ton of wheat in the US? Well, it takes 10 hours to make a ton of wheat. If we shift those 10 hours to computer production, we make what? 1/10, I know that's strange, of a computer. In Japan, what's the opportunity cost of one computer? Well, 125 hours devoted to wheat production would produce 5 tons of wheat. But the opportunity cost of a ton of wheat would just be what? 1/5 of a computer. 25 hours is enough to make 1/5 of a computer. Now we can identify who has the comparative advantage. Between the US and Japan, who has a lower opportunity cost of producing computers here? Japan or the US? Japan. It only costs Japan 5 tons of wheat compared to 10 tons of wheat in the US. So Japan should specialize in computer production and export surplus computers to the US. Who has the comparative advantage in wheat production? The United States does. It only costs us 1/10 of a computer to make a ton of wheat compared to 1/5 of a computer in Japan. So the US has a comparative advantage in wheat production. Even though it's possible to have one country have an absolute advantage in the production of both goods, it will never be possible for one country to have a comparative advantage in the production of both goods. Why is that? I know I've completely run out of time, but let me ask this last question. Why is it impossible to have one country have a comparative advantage in the production of both goods? Hopefully you can see it mathematically. If one country has a low opportunity cost of one good, it's going to have a higher opportunity cost of the other, because the opportunity cost of one good, computers here, is just the reciprocal of the opportunity cost of the other, right? So it's never going to be the case that one country is going to have a lower opportunity cost for both goods. It could be the case that both countries have identical opportunity costs. In that case, are there going to be any benefits from trade? No. That each country might as well just be self-sufficient. There's no gains from trade in that situation. But in the real world, we know that countries have different opportunity costs. And because of that, there's always going to be potential gains from trade. I'm going to finish up this discussion in the next class. I've probably got maybe 10 minutes of talking left. And then what I want to do for the remainder of the class is work through some practice problems together, give you guys an opportunity to do some more problems of the caliber that you might see on your first midterm exam, okay? See you guys on Thursday. One second.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
Go ahead.
So on this, like just the beginning of the definition of like exports and imports, is it like the same as in the textbook, or do you post like the
You missed the what now?
the writing
Oh,
down
the definitions. Those definitions should be in the textbook, yeah.
Okay, I was just making sure. I know those aren't like super big. Or like this.
Yeah, if that happens in class, if you're trying to get something down and I move too quickly through a slide, just raise up your hand and say, 10 more seconds, please.
Okay.
I'd sometimes go through stuff quickly and then other things too slow.
It's not that big of a deal. I was just like trying to fiddle with the graphs and stuff. Thank you though.
Sure.